From a young liberation fighter inspired by the ideals of freedom and equality for all, former President Jacob Zuma's image is now synonymous with a Stalingrad tactician, a Houdini, and the man whose presidency brought the country close to the brink of collapse.
The fact that I was lambasted with a punitive jail sentence without trial is something which should induce a sense of shock to all those who cherish freedom and the rule of law.
As the country tries to process the meaning of a rampage that left parts of it burnt, looted and destroyed, with over 200 people having lost their lives in the mayhem, 79-year-old Zuma remains imprisoned for 15 months at Durban's Escort prison for violating the rule of law. While the fragility of South Africa's democracy is tested, the world watches on in disbelief.
So in one level is to use the law and the language of the law to delegitimize what the courts are doing.
Democracy gets to a point where it has to defend itself. That's what we are going through right now in South Africa.
We must strengthen the democratic institutions of state and continually enhance their capacity to serve the people. We must safeguard the independence and integrity of those institutions tasked with the defense of democracy, and that must act as a check on the abuse of power.
Never in the history of South Africa has a head of state courted as much controversy as former President Jacob Zuma. His legacy remains highly contested. His strained relations with the media became prominent when allegations surfaced regarding his government role between 1994 and 1999 as KwaZulu-Natal's MEC for Economic Affairs and Tourism. Businessman Schabir Shaik, whom Zuma said was his financial advisor, was convicted for soliciting a bribe for Zuma from a French arms company, Thomson CSF, now called Thales, in relation to South Africa's controversial multi-billion rand arms deal, which Zuma still has to defend himself against.
He became MEC for Economic Development in KZN, you see. And his association with Schabir Shaik, you see, in KZN, and also the rape trial. And just when he was starting his presidency, there was also another scandal involving a love child with a friend's daughter, you see. So all these things came together. Besides that, the way how he came to power, in fact, the defeat of Mbeki Polokwane shocked a lot of people, you see. People never expected that Mr. Zuma would have such powerful organizational skills.
I think the media made it its job to paint Mr. Zuma or President Zuma corrupt, to paint President Zuma incompetent and all of that. I mean, an example, for instance, in fact, something that I'm still following up with Sunday Times as an example. They've got this nice picture of a huge mansion in Dubai, as an example, which they said President Zuma owns, and next door to that house is a Mugabe. A blue lie. That's what they've been doing. Now everyone is sitting there saying, wow, this guy, we are struggling here. And now on his side, he's busy building mansions. And anybody that's saying President Zuma is corrupt must please assist us with evidence.
His legacy that is uncontested is his contribution to the KwaZulu-Natal political violence of the 80s and 90s, between the IFP, ANC, and the UDF, resulting in losses of many lives.
He played an important role in Natal during that conflict between Inkatha and ANC. He brokered peace, but at the same time, he created a base for himself, a base to use when contesting power in the ANC. He actually used that base in KZN to move up the ladder and eventually become president of the country.
In 2005, part of that base descended on Johannesburg in front of the High Court, where Zuma appeared on allegations of raping then 31-year-old Fezekile Kuzwayo. Kwezi, as she was known at the time, knew Zuma from exile as he was friends with her late father. Both were ANC youth members who were later sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Zuma denied the allegations, saying there was a political motive behind them. He was later acquitted of the charges. Throughout the trial, Kwezi endured hostile Zuma's supporters and eventually left the country for her safety. She returned to South Africa and later died in 2016.
What we got from there was the issue of believability, that women who come forward to accuse men who are as powerful as Jacob Zuma must not be believed because there is a sinister ploy behind it. It is a rape charge that is about discrediting the person. And so the conversation should not be what happened in that room, but it is about who sent you.
There are cases, truth be told, where charges get dropped and you don't know why they get dropped and all of that. And I don't want to get into that. The only point I really want to make is that President Zuma went to court. The court found him not guilty. Now, if there is a problem with that verdict, President Zuma did not make that verdict. It was made by the court.
What we have seen in the Zondo Commission and also other exposés about what happened in the Zuma era has been to give Black women this presumption of incompetence. Because most of the time, whenever they have come in this public commission of inquiry, the people who were put in this position are people who are struggling to defend the decisions that they took. But we also see the thing about the disposability of women in these struggles that he characterizes as political. We see the way in which Justice Kampepe's decision has been characterized as emotional. It's also part of that legacy that says that women are incapable of rational thought or of coming to rational decisions.
The struggle for a free South Africa was a struggle for justice where everyone is treated equally before the law. Constitutional democracy should mean no one, not even judges, are above the law.
Even in the face of imminent arrest after the Constitutional Court sentenced him to a 15-year jail term for contempt of court, Zuma remained defiant, maintaining the correctness of his refusal to appear before the State Capture Commission, having insisted on its chairperson's recusal on the basis of bias due to a past relationship, which Judge Raymond Zondo denies.
It's not nice to see former President Jacob Zuma going to jail. But democracy gets to a point where it has to defend itself. A democracy can suspend itself in order to defend itself. Because with a democracy, once you threaten to to undermine basic foundations. You're now challenging the core of a democracy. And when a democracy does that, many people criticize it. This is not democratic. It looks like the apartheid government, this and that and that. The state is still very democratic.
At the time of editing this show, 6 of the alleged masterminds of the clearly planned anti-Zuma arrest mayhem had been apprehended. The violence sparked further criminality and exploded a powder keg of suppressed frustration in a jobless economy, exacerbated by the COVID-19 jobs bloodbath.
President Zuma has been sentenced without trial and people are angry. The righteous anger of the people is because unjustness is being meted out to President Zuma, and people are revolting against that unjustness. So we hope that the recession case will give Constitutional Court a golden opportunity to self-correct.
This is exactly what contempt of court proceedings are about. And we have seen examples of this. A lawyer who is bringing the administration of justice into disrepute can simply be taken from the courtroom into the prison cells because they've acted in contempt of court. So in one level is to use the law and the language of the law to delegitimize what the courts are doing. So that's going to be a very big legacy of Jacob Zuma.
Zuma's 2-term administration from 2009 is referred to by some as 9 wasted years of South Africa's development due to allegations of corruption, cronyism, and repurposing the state for the benefit of his friends and family. But his supporters believe that he is a victim of his conviction to radically transform the economy. But what is the legacy of Zuma's administration?
We cannot blame him for everything. We need to be fair, because where this thing begins is that Mr. Zuma inherited a paralyzed state. He inherited a state which had been arrested even before him. I say it's an arrested state in the sense that it's a state which could not live up to its developmental ambitions.
Experts say the state paralysis was partly due to the 2008 global financial crisis and the post-democratic state-created dependency, with 18 million people relying on social grants. Despite the policy and pronouncements on intent, the economy remained jobless and unequal. Zuma introduced a long-term socio-economic policy, the National Development Plan 2030, 3 years into his presidency.
Mdate Zuma then replaced Askisa with the NDP, which again didn't look that different. I mean, it was supposed to be just a redistributive macroeconomic policy. The labor markets, especially the labor unions at the time, had built some consensus around it. And I think also the ticket that Mr. Zuma came in on was slightly more left-leaning, or at least willing to listen to more developmental, more inclusive forms of economy, rather than the third wave approach, which Mr. Mbeki seemed to favor. The other piece, of course, of Mdate Zuma's legacy was fighting HIV/AIDS. And I think here, that the Zuma administration is to be highly commended for securing about 150 billion rands, partly through external funding, but to continue a really important rollout of antiretroviral drugs, and also a multiple package of both health, pharmaceutical interventions, as well as financial interventions.
Some say Zuma can be credited for emphasizing rural development and the development of black industrialists to develop black-owned enterprises, but was criticized as a continuation of enriching the few. The Mineral and Petroleum Resources Bill raised eyebrows for, among others, proposed license conditions for mineral exports, quota requirements on strategic minerals, and permits only for majority black-owned companies.
the idea there was to enable the state to have 20%, a 20% shareholding of mining assets. So in some respects, I think this is where his reputation, founded or unfounded, for being somebody who was willing to try slightly more radical, and I use that word cautiously, but slightly more, adventurous forms of state reform and of statist intervention in minerals and in the economy probably came to pass. I think the concerns there were that, of course, this might be a form of an opportunity to divert some of those resources, mining resources, into the hands of a few people, perhaps political acolytes and family members and part of the political elite, a concern which probably bears some resonance and bears some investigation. Another part of this was there was also the mining charter, which was supposed to give mining companies 12 months in which to transfer 30% of ownership and 30% asset base to African-owned and African-based entities. Now, some people saw this as a return to the glory days of BBEE and broad-based Black economic empowerment. Others thought that this was really another form of a recontracting of those very same problematics that emerged through BBEE. He then proposed the land expropriation bill in 2016, that should be, which would then enable the government to address, previous disparities, at least on paper, previous disparities in land ownership. Some called it populism. Some also suggested that this was an attempt to draw attention away from the growing EFF, who had begun to popularize the notion of land. Of course, that's not their calling card.
In 2016, following her own investigation, then Public Protector Thuli Madonsela recommended the establishment of an inquiry into allegations that former President Zuma and other state functionaries had an improper and unethical relationship regarding the affairs of the state. Evidence has been led implicating Zuma or his alleged associates directly or indirectly in creating a shadow state which made questionable appointments and manipulated contracts, some under the guise of economic transformation, at entities such as power utility Eskom, SAA and Denel, among others.
Every team has a captain, and I think for 9 years Mr. Zuma was the captain, and it's a very muddy legacy, I must say. The other thing I think that's quite significant was that on Mr. Zuma, I think there were about 9 cabinet reshuffles. I mean, remember that he was ever chincha riding. He was ever shuffling people around, and would wake up and there's a new finance minister, and particularly those key strategic clusters. The finance ministry that had quite a succession. So all of these things really make it such a difficult, make Mr. Zuma a very complicated person to assess in terms of his final contribution. But I think that the state, in terms of financial and economic performance, objectively, I mean, just looking at the statistics, was far worse off after his presidency than it was when he entered the presidency.
Part of the cabinet reshuffle included the controversial change of 3 finance ministers in 4 days, resulting in huge losses to the economy in a single day. Eventually, after sustained local and international pressure and the negative image of South Africa, faced with a vote of no confidence in Parliament, Zuma resigned on the 14th of February 2018. The State Capture Commission is yet to conclude its work, But is Zuma a champion of radical economic transformation?
Many of these things were not per se articulated as a coherent, cohesive frame that we could really engage with, wrestle with point by point. The word radical was something that was used to often describe very, 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 very slight shifts from one process to the other. And radical is something that really encompasses a deep transformation. And people often have assumed, especially in our context, that radical means radical left. Radical and left are not the same thing.
It was President Zuma's program that was leading the issue of the nationalization of the Reserve Bank. Where are we with that? The second thing is that the radical socio-economic transformation program then also said there must be a state bank and all of that. And the Post Bank was identified as a bank that was well positioned to be converted into that. Again, part of the resolutions was that there's going to be expropriation without compensation. This is what was resolved. But what is the current government doing, or the current ANC doing? They have distorted the NASREC resolution on that matter.
Now, awaiting a constitutional court decision and still facing corruption allegations, a political solution has been suggested. But some say peace cannot be attained at the expense of justice.
Pitting peace against justice or justice against peace is the wrong way to go about it. Put simply, you cannot have the one without the other. In order for you to be able to have the kind of legal system in which people are held to account in courts of law, you do need to have a situation and a context of relative peace. For you to be able to be certain that peace will be sustainable, you need to have those institutions in place that check the excesses of individuals and of the state. The question is, for who are political solutions open? Are they open for the ordinary person like myself and yourself, or are they only for political leaders?
As the Zuma legal battles continue to unravel on the South African body politic, the country remains at the crossroads, and the strength of its democracy is tested as fears of more violence linger, with the Constitutional Court's decision that is yet to be announced. Zuma stands accused of using delay tactics to account for his years in office. From a liberation fighter who spent many years willing to die for freedom, how will history record Zuma, the post-liberation African leader? What kind of a legacy does he leave?
Modern political leaders, all of them, have their weaknesses, but there are those whose weaknesses are worse, are so glaring, you see, because you'll find that they are attracted by money, they are attracted by power, they want to enrich their own families. And unfortunately, Mr. Zuma, even though he was involved in the liberation struggle, has all those qualities, which I describe as the worst frailties of modern political leadership.
President Zuma, His Excellency, is a symbol of resistance to oppression. All his life, President Zuma has fought to ensure that we've got a free South Africa. President Zuma understood that you cannot have equal treatment of unequal people.
We also have to look at ourselves, we have to look at our systems, we have to look at our institutions. We also have to look at the kind of environment, like anywhere else, that gives rise to the emergence of particular personalities, particular institutional erosion, because 9 years is a long time, for this to happen.